So I am doing a presentation today on John Brown, who was an American revolutionary. He was a radical abolitionist who tried to lead an armed slave rebellion in the United States. He was born on May 9th of 1800. His parents were abolitionists, and as he was growing up, they taught him that, that slavery was evil, and this was something they installed in him at a very young age. Despite this, his parents actually had befriended a slave owner. And for some reason, when he was a child, he was actually sent to live with this man for a short period of time. Now this man owned a young slave who was a small boy about the same age as John Brown. And when John Brown was staying with the slave owner, he would regularly see the slave owner beat this very young slave and was completely powerless to protect and defend his new friend, and scarred him at a very early age. Now, they said it was because of this that when he grew up and as a man heard the news of the death of Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist and a journalist, John Brown had somewhat of a different reaction because he was not a little boy anymore. And he attended a town meeting the next day, and he stood up and in front of the entire town, he said, "Okay, I, John Brown, on this day, I dedicate my life to the abolition of slavery." So just a little bit about, here we go, John Brown. Now he was something of an unusual character. He was a deeply religious man. He could recite the entire Bible from memory. Yet in spite of this, he did not prescribe to any specific denomination, and he was not a church member, which was very unusual for a man in America during that time. You'll see him classified a lot as a Calvinist. To that, I would say I'm not so sure. He certainly had a lot of tendencies that Calvinists tend to have, but he also had a lot of aspects to his character that most Calvinists do not have. So I think he might be mislabeled that way, but that's what you'll hear people say. So, I am not actually sure which one of these is him, but one of these children, that's is John Brown with his parents, and that's his family. He was actually more than just an abolitionist. He was an egalitarian. Not all abolitionists during this time period actually agreed with the idea that blacks and whites were equals, but John Brown did. In fact, he believed in, he was egalitarian across the board. He believed in racial equality, he believed in gender equality, and he believed in class equality. Even his enemies would agree that John Brown was by nature a very generous and hospitable man. So when he began, being active on the abolitionist scene, it would happen a lot that he'd meet other abolitionists, and they would say, "Oh yes, I know you. You're the great John Brown. I heard about what you did. As for me, I've been working with this newspaper, or whatever." And John Brown by nature would just say, "Oh well, that's great. You should come visit me. Come stay at my house, and you can be my guest, and we'll talk about this and that, and we'll put our heads together, and we'll come up with some new ideas." And it happened quite a few times that when these abolitionists would show up to his house, then he would be shocked to find that there were actually black people staying in the house with him, and they would sit down at the meal times at the dinner table with everybody, and they'd all eat dinner. And John Brown would actually, address them by their last name with the prefix of Mr., and it would be this huge scandal. They'd have to run and tell everybody that they knew that this was the kind of thing that went on at John Brown's house. So, while an egalitarian at heart, he did dedicate his life to the cause of abolition because he felt that it was the most egregious form of oppression during his time. He felt like it was the cause that needed him the most. For a variety of reasons, as an older man, John Brown moved to Kansas, where several of his adult children were living. During this time, Kansas was in fact not a state, it was a territory, and the population was pretty divided between the pro-slavery forces and the abolitionists. And as it became apparent that Kansas was going to achieve statehood, there was a lot of debate. Would it be a free state? Would it be a free state? Would it be a slave state? Now there was a senator, pictured here, by the name of Charles Sumner, who gave a speech in Washington, D.C. the purpose of the speech being to push for Kansas to be a free state. But within the state, within the speech, he very aggressively rebuked slave owners. He shamed the South, and he also made a lot of veiled but somewhat obvious references to the fact that within the institution of slavery, male slave owners were viciously taking advantage of their slaves in a sexual manner, which was not a secret during the time, but it was not something that people talked about. Now, there was another senator named Preston Brooks, and when he heard the speech, he became enraged, and he attacked Charles Sumner in front of the Senate. Now, you'll hear the attack referred to as a caning. Not technically inaccurate, but kind of a misleading statement. The weapon that he used was a cane with a very large and heavy head at the top of it. And he actually beat Charles Sumner in the head until the cane broke. While another senator stood there with a gun holding off all these other senators who were trying to stop what was happening. It was a very vicious attack. Now, John Brown heard about this in Kansas within about 2 days. And what happened next is open to debate. The details are a little sketchy, but what it said that when John Brown heard the news, he gathered several of his neighbors as well as his sons, and that they went out to 5 different houses, gathered several slave owners and several slave hunters, and dragged them out into the streets and shot them. John Brown himself always said he was not involved with it, he was not there, he had nothing to do with anything. It's very, it's very telling. People that criticize John Brown point to one of 2 events, and this is one of them. This is one of the 2. It's very telling that people like to label him a psychopath or even a terrorist for this, while kind of ignoring the fact that all of his alleged victims were men who profited from and partook in systematic oppression, rape, and murder. It leads to the question as to why they condemn John Brown and not these men. The only, kind of the obvious answer being that John Brown's victims were white. Well, his victims' were not. So, after the massacre, John Brown got on the move because there were people out there now who were angry. There are people that want to do him harm. They were, in fact, people who were so outraged that John Brown would resort to violence that they got a lynch mob together and went out and lynched 2 of John Brown's sons, who were not even there at the time. But he gets on the move. He's kind of traveling around, staying with some different people, and he realizes this at some point that he's not going to be on the run forever. And at this time, he develops this very dark sense of humor about his own impending doom, which seems very obvious to him. He's staying with his abolitionist family, and he hears some unsubstantiated rumors that these federal marshals have been deployed to arrest him. And so he barricades himself with furniture in the guest room of this couple's house, and the woman of the house finds him, and he says something about, well, she asks him, why is there all this furniture against the door, what are you doing? He says, well, I know that I will never be taken alive, and I didn't want to spoil your carpet. And that was kind of his response as to why he's heading out. The next family that he stayed with, he moved on and stayed with another family that kind of opened their arms to him. And they had a very young daughter. John Brown himself was a father. He had 15 children. And anyway, so when he shows up at this house, he brings a doll for this little girl. And he gives it to her, and he's kind of playing with her. And at one point, she climbs up into his lap. And at that moment, he told her, he said, you have to remember this. Because one day, you're going to hang me. And then you can tell everybody, oh yeah, I remember that guy. He came to my house and he gave me a doll and I was playing with him and then I climbed up on his lap. He's like, so you should remember this. And that's what he tells this very small child. So I want to talk a little bit now about the issue of violence. I love this picture. I just found this on the internet. So I had to include it. Now, while he denied any involvement in this Potawatomi massacre, John Brown did not necessarily, on a theoretical level, kind of refused to consider the idea of violence as a tool to use in the cause of abolition. And most abolitionists at this time did endorse nonviolence. In fact, it was kind of a tension between John Brown and his good friend Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a little weary of John Brown's idea of having a full-out rebellion, and he was hesitant to it. In addition, Frederick Douglass was just not entirely sold on John Brown's ability to actually lead a rebellion. He was a little hesitant about that. But what's interesting is when John Brown begins planning this full-on rebellion, if you look at what his plans were and what he set out to do, he developed a plan to have a revolution and a rebellion that did not necessitate the death of a single solitary soul. No one had to die in John Brown's plan. On some level, he figured people probably would die, but he was still thinking he could keep bloodshed to a very bare minimum. So the plan is to move on a small town called Harpers Ferry, which is located in Virginia. They had a federal arsenal there, and his plan was to gather some men. They were going to take this town by force, rob the arsenal of its weapons, and then march. They were going to march until they came to the very first plantation they could find. They were going to go to the slaves, they were going to arm them, they were going to all then collectively go and find the slave owners and say, well, hey there, we're kind of here, your slaves are here, we've got guns, and we say you don't have any slaves anymore. How do you feel about that? It's okay? Is that good with you guys? All right, we'll just be on our way then. And they would then leave. And then they would march. Hopefully, the slaves that they had just liberated would feel compelled to join with the militia. They were going to march then, go on to the next plantation, and do the same thing again. And the plan was to continue on that way, to grow in numbers, and just do it again and again and again until Virginia was a free state. Now, would John Brown have shot anyone who tried to say, no, I don't think so, I'm going to get my gun and I'm going to stop you guys? Sure. But he would have spared anyone who said, oh, okay, yeah, that's great, that's good, you guys, I'm outnumbered here, you guys are good to go. So, especially, there's a lot of criticism of his for using violence, and I just think that's a good point to remember, that if you really look at what his plan was, it did not necessitate the death of a single person. Now, this plan that he had originally called to have 4,500 men to begin with. He eventually did move on Harpers Ferry, and he had 21 men at the time. Now his response, if somebody wanted to say a word against him, as a quote here, as he said to his neighbors, "Caution, sir, I am eternally tired of hearing that word caution. It is nothing but the word of a coward." Possibly one of the reasons that his numbers were kind of low, he actually didn't know Frederick Douglass, as John Brown was going around recruiting people to join him, Frederick Douglass was kind of discouraging people, saying, like, I don't think this guy's headed towards anything, you might want to stay away from that. So he has only 21 men, and he says, all right, come on, the time is now, let's go, let's do it. Doesn't go over too well. The town of Harpers Ferry is armed by several Virginia militiamen, and they have a shootout with these militiamen. It's not going very well, so what they do is they quickly grab some hostages, and then they hole up inside this arsenal in Harpers Ferry. One of the stories, I really wasn't able to verify it very much, was that when they went, these hostages they took, they were all slave owners, and what they did was they went into the house with guns, and they were saying, give us your valuables, we want your money, give us something of worth. And of course they would give them whatever they had on hand that was valuable. And what they would do is they'd take it, they went and they distributed it among the slaves and said, guess what, this is yours now. And then they kind of grabbed the slave owners and they ran off, and they dragged them into this arsenal where they're now holding up because there's these brutal militiamen outside. And one of the men that they had taken was actually a relative of George Washington. And he recalled that it was very bizarre that John Brown was kind of treating them with this this difference of a hospitable host, and he sent this armed guard out to an inn, and he brought back this like delicious breakfast spread, and then he's like, come on everybody, we're gonna dine now, and they sat down, and he's kind of trying to engage with them and debate them on, you know, theology, and he's, you know, trying to kind of persuade them to kind of come to his side, and that they were a little baffled afterwards, that they really weren't quite sure what to make of him. So, pretty soon, the president hears word of what's been going on. Now, what he hears was that there are hundreds of armed slaves that have risen up in Virginia and are staging this huge revolt. He kind of, he's a little off the information he gets. So he says, well, now there's a slave insurrection. So he gathers this new detachment that's composed of some militiamen as well as some Marines. So he sends them out to go and to squash this insurrection. I don't know. Who knows or who wants to guess who was in charge of leading the movement against John Brown at Harpers Ferry?
Robert E.
Yes. The president sends out Robert E. Lee, which is filled with some irony I probably don't have to point out. Okay. So Robert E. Lee is, he's not a general, I believe he was a colonel at this time. He's a military man from a long military family, and he was actually sickened when he showed up at Harpers Ferry because these Virginia militiamen that had been there after having shot several of the revolutionaries have gone and become very intoxicated and have started mutilating the dead bodies. And the first thing he actually sees when he shows up is a man lying on the grounds right outside the arsenal who is he's missing a face. His face is gone. And he was very upset when he showed up, and that was the first thing he found. Now, inside the arsenal, things are not going very well. I'm sure a couple of John Brown's sons that were there with him during the raid. We had Owen Brown and Watson Brown. Owen Brown was wounded in some of the initial fighting, but he did not die instantaneously. Some of the witnesses that were there say that he was screaming in pain for several hours before he finally begged John Brown to put a bullet in his head. He said, please kill me, please end it. People who were there say John Brown picked him up and put him in a corner and said, you're going to die, so die like a man. And then he left his son there to die. Now, that's kind of a harsh story, but there's some evidence to suggest that John Brown was in fact moved by this. When you hear about the eventual shootout at Harpers Ferry, one of the things people always like to say is that, like, you know, John Brown was just this crazy psychopath with a death wish, and Robert E. Lee offered him a chance to surrender, and you know, he said no. He said he wasn't going to. Which is not technically untrue. However, shortly before Robert E. Lee offered him a chance to surrender, after Owen has finally died, John Brown goes to Watson, and he sends Watson outside unarmed with a white flag, because he decides he's going to save the son he has left. And Watson is shot and killed on sight. Eventually, Robert E. Lee sends an offer to surrender. John Brown says, I'm not doing this again. I sent my son out, you kill my son. No, I'm not going to surrender. Robert E. Lee gives the signal. The military attacks this arsenal.
I want to put that on my lash.
Everyone is either captured or killed within under 3 minutes is the time estimation that they give. John Brown himself is actually knocked unconscious and then dragged off and arrested. He's charged with murder and he's charged with treason, the treason being slave insurrection. So now we have a movement that begins to try to save John Brown. Here is a newspaper clipping. You can see it's as his trial is being prepared. They're asking people to pray for him. People in the South are mad. They want his blood. They want him dead. People in the North are fighting for him. But some of the most strongest support actually came from overseas. Here we have in the form of Victor Hugo, who was a French politician and novelist. He led a campaign for France to try to save John Brown. One of the quotes we have here says, "Let America know and ponder this. There's something more frightening than Cain killing Abel, and that is Washington killing Spartacus." Another one of the quotes, he said to someone else once, he said Americans were trying to kill their glory in order to save their shame. The glory being John Brown, the shame being the institution of slavery, and perhaps Virginia in particular, I don't know. As for John Brown himself, he seemed pretty resigned to his fate from the get-go. He never tried to defend himself. At trial, when he did get a chance to speak, it was to lecture the jury on the evils of slavery and trying to persuade their minds. Perhaps the closest he came to maybe defending himself was to angrily point out that he said if he had done what he did for the slaves for anyone else, that they would be trying to figure out how to best reward him and not whether or not to kill him. John Brown's own lawyer, John Brown had a lawyer, and the lawyer's defense was that there was no evidence that John Brown himself had killed anyone. And there wasn't, for all we know, he never did shoot anyone during the battle. And otherwise to say that, sadly, they had never succeeded in actually recruiting any slaves to come and fight for them. So the lawyer argued that slave insurrection was there. These were free men. They can be held only accountable for their own actions. You have no right to charge them with treason. That argument did not fly. He was, in fact, sentenced to death. This is actually a sketch made by someone who was there that day, so this is a sketch of John Brown's body. He himself said, "Let them hang me. I'm worth inconceivably more to hang than I am any other purpose." The only conceivable regret that John Brown may have had was that he had perhaps maybe not been more violent and more aggressive. He passed a note to someone on the day of his execution, and he said, "I, John Brown, am now convinced that the sins of this country can only be washed away with blood, and before I had naively allowed myself to think that it might have been done without very much bloodshed." I love this painting. This is a painting of John Brown. He's being led to the gallows, and you can see there's a woman holding up her baby, and he's kissing it. And on the day that he died, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "Some 1800 years ago, Christ was crucified. This morning, John Brown was hung. He is not old Brown any longer. He is an angel of light." So John Brown's legacy today, one of the historians I came across said, there's not much of a middle ground with John Brown. People tend to love him or they tend to hate him. Some images I have. So he is loved or he is reviled. Some historians have gone so far as to label him America's first domestic terrorist, where, others have the opposite opinion. Malcolm X once remarked, referring to his group's policy of not having whites join, was that if John Brown could rise from the dead, that they let him in. The rock band Kansas has two of their different album covers depict John Brown, and they wrote a song about him called "Carry On."